Good evening. Hope it is that for you, that it is a good evening. It's good to be here. Good to see each of you. And I could just keep those goods going, but I'll stop there. I am glad to see each of you because you don't know how many people told me this morning that after the preacher almost burned the church building down, they weren't even sure they were coming back tonight. But I'm glad everybody came back tonight. I'm glad to see you, and I'm glad to have this time to study this evening. Somebody tried to guess the subject of tonight's sermon when they saw the title, just the title, The Man Who Has Everything. And they said it, and they asked, and then I said, no, it's about Superman. It's about Superman. Because in 1985, they released a comic series with that title. Well, slightly different. I didn't steal this one totally, but it is for the man who has everything. And it made its way into the animated show, and it's all about Superman's birthday. What do you get for the man who has everything? And then I walked in tonight, and somebody told me that they saw the title, and they knew it didn't have anything to do with them, because they're not the man who has everything. But no, the sermon this evening is not about Superman or a superhero, and it's not about anybody in this room. It is about the man that we know most often as Solomon, King Solomon. What can we learn about this man, King Solomon? He's mentioned almost 300 times in the Hebrew Bible, from Genesis to Malachi as we have it now. He's mentioned about a dozen times in what we call the New Testament, or Matthew to Revelation. He's known as the king who built the temple in Jerusalem. There were others, but he built the temple, Solomon's temple for the Lord. Eventually, Herod's temple, that is in Jerusalem at Jesus' time, portions of that temple were still named after the old king Solomon. You might find that mentioned a couple of times in the book of Acts, for example. Solomon's porch or portico. Jesus references Solomon. He mentions his splendor, the way that he was arrayed in splendor. Yes, there's a lot that we could say. But we could say then that at least from one angle of the story, Solomon was the man who had everything. But he's also the man who, in another way, had everything and then lost everything. And so for the time that remains, I wanted to do 7 lessons from the life, the person of the character of Solomon, but that sermon would have been 2 hours long. This one's just going to be an hour long, heads up. Okay, not really, but we have 6 for this evening. 6. So we are going to hit them pretty quickly to get more of a shotgun or overview look at Solomon's life. That we learn from Solomon that God can turn ugly into beauty. We learn about asking rightly, or the ability to ask, and we're asking both humbly and correctly. We also see that it's one thing to have wisdom. We'll see more about that in a moment. We also learn from Solomon that success isn't always what it's cracked up to be. We learn that relationships can be problematic. If you're trying to fill out the handout already, you're going to have trouble with that one. And then the last one is we learn about the value of wholeheartedness. That one you can figure out on the handout, I hope, already. Wholeheartedness. So let's open up together to 1st or 2nd Samuel. We're going to be in 1 Kings primarily tonight. Let's turn to 1st to 2nd Samuel chapter 12. As we realize from Solomon's life, or maybe better I should say, we're reminded from Solomon's life that God can take something ugly, something that involves great sin even, and can change that, transform it into something beautiful. 2 Samuel chapter 12. 2 Samuel chapter 12. We'll read verses 24 and 25. 2 Samuel 12, 24 and 25. It says, Then David comforted his wife, Bathsheba, and went into her and lay with her, and she bore a son. I'll stop there for a moment and make sure we're all in the right place in the story of David and now Solomon's life. This is following the events of David, the nice way to put it is affair, but his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba. He murders her husband. All of this has just gone down, and now the child that was born from that initial relationship has died. That's why David is said to be comforting his wife here. And now she bears another son, and he called his name Solomon. And then look at this. It says, the Lord loved him and sent a message by Nathan the prophet. So here God creates this beautiful result. And the writer makes sure we know that God loved him, and then he sends a message about that love through, of all people, Nathan. Prophet who was sent earlier to tell David what he had done. He sends this message by Nathan, and so he called his name Jedediah because of the Lord. And small plug here, that is where we got the name Jedediah, for that Jedediah, not this Jedediah. It's like, here I am. And that name in Hebrew refers to one who is beloved, or one whom the Lord loves. And so David and Bathsheba have another son. God has a special love for him at his birth. Sends a prophet to give him another name in reference to God's love for Solomon. Think about different times when we can see this in our lives. We can see this in our world, our country. I know many of us have been to the memorial in Oklahoma City. And one of the things that I'm always amazed at, and just you almost want to stop and just take a moment. I mean, there's a lot of those, but one of those is the survivor's tree. Anybody know what I'm talking about? The tree that survived. And now it's become this symbol of hope and being able to grieve and yet continue on. Think of that here. God takes what is ugly and traumatic, and he can lead to things like Solomon, Jedediah. Now, you'll notice on the handout there's an option there for the best example. And before we do move on, I think the best example of this is the cross. You've probably heard it said that it was the worst thing that's ever happened. It's also the greatest or best thing that's ever happened. When man put God on the cross, or when God went to the cross for man, God takes what is ugly and transforms it into beauty. But now let's go to 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 3. The second thing we see about Solomon is we learn some things about asking. The ability to ask for the right things, and even to ask carefully, properly. It's quite the ability in life. Whether you're asking something from God in prayer, and being careful not to ask selfishly, like James warns about, not to ask just to spend on your own pleasures. That's just coming from James 4. Or it's asking something from your boss, or asking something from your spouse, whatever it is. There's so many occasions in life when this skill or this ability is so helpful. 1 Kings chapter 3 is when God appears to Solomon at Gibeon, and he says, ask what I shall give to you. And here's what Solomon says in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 7. This is part of his response to God, his request to God. He says, and now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father. Although I am but a little child, I do not know how to come out or go in. Look at his humility here in verses 7 and 8 of 1 Kings 3. Solomon's about 20 at this age. He's going to go on to reign for 40 years, just like the two prior kings. He says, this is who I am. I'm just a child. I'm your servant. He goes on to say, your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people. He's not singing his praises. If anything, he's singing God's and the people. The people are great. You are great. I'm stuck in the middle as their ruler. I need help. So he says, a people too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. So there's something to be learned about humility from Solomon. What would you do if God came to you directly like this and said, ask me whatever you want? And then we'd start pulling out our Christmas list. We'd start writing all these things. And Solomon says, I'm just a little child who needs you to help me rule your people. And so he asked correctly. Look at verses 9 through 14 of 1 Kings 3. He says, give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people? And then we're given some commentary from the writer that it pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. And God said to him, because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life, or riches, or the life of your enemies, you haven't given the usual requests that many of us would ask for. Hopefully we might not ask for that last one, but then again, because you haven't asked for these things, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. I'm going to give you what you asked for. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind. That none like you has been before you, and none like you shall rise after you. I give you also what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. The man who had everything. And there's this little condition attached here in verse 14. If you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. I'm going to give you the wisdom you asked for. I'm going to throw in some honor and some riches. I'm going to make you like nobody else ever. And then if you follow my commandments, I'll also give you a long life. Say what you want about Solomon, regardless of how you view him. There's something to be said about the way he asked, both humbly and correctly. But then, and this kind of provides some early balance to Solomon's life, we also learn from Solomon that having wisdom is one thing. And then I didn't finish that out on the handout or anything, but the idea is it's one thing to have wisdom in that you have it in your mind, like he asked, I want a discerning mind. And God said, I'm going to give you a mind. And then he writes what we call Proverbs, a lengthy document of wise sayings. It's one thing to have it in here. It's one thing to write it down here. But it's something else to actually live it. Keep the prepositions going out here in your life, as whether you're king or whoever you are. Look at 1 Kings chapter 4 now, verse 30. This is just one passage of several in this area of Scripture and other places about Solomon's wisdom. 1 Kings chapter 4. We're going to go ahead and pick up at verse 29. It says, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure and breadth of mind like the sand of the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. And then there's a list of men that he was wiser than. And I know you know who these people are. They're the people that you looked up to. And okay, not really. But he gives us some idea for their culture. And the idea is that Solomon, he didn't just have some wisdom. He had a wisdom that was so immense. It was just incredible. People would come from miles and miles just to listen to Solomon. What would that be like if people just started showing up at your door and you go, okay, what are you here for? And it's, I just want to listen to your wisdom. Now, I'm not going to ask anybody to raise their hand if anybody's ever said that at all to them, but this is who Solomon is. The text goes on to describe how he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. You get an exact number of his songs. And then He begins to say how he spoke of the trees and the beast and birds. It seems that he had a poetic mind along with this wisdom. He writes wise sayings, he writes songs. He had everything. But then, to give away the rest of the story, Solomon didn't make very many wise choices in his life. So that's why I say it's one thing to have wisdom, it's another to put it into practice. I recently read a quote in a leadership context that said, real leaders seek wisdom, not success. That the success may come or may not, and success is not sustainable without wisdom that is both acquired and applied. And however you go about, in this case, your business, but that applies to more than just running a business, more than just being a leader. It applies in life. But that's Solomon. Someone once wrote that Solomon is the wisest fool, they said it, not me, wisest fool who ever wore a crown. Because he had so much wisdom. And he was blessed and inspired to write so much of it down so we could read it and benefit from it. But then you hold that up to his life, and again, not that his life is just a horrible mess altogether. We've already seen that he had certainly some good things to be said about him. But I almost wonder if sometimes we turn Solomon into this children's story guy who was the good King Solomon, who asked for wisdom. God gave him wisdom. He wrote the wisdom down. He built a beautiful temple for God, and then it's happily ever after. But that's not all there is to the story of Solomon. It's more, you get to that point, and then there is no happily ever after. Then he begins to be influenced by his relationships, and we're overlapping some here. He begins to fall in to false worship and idolatry. He begins to do things that are, in some ways, at the height of sin and arrogance and rebellion against God. We're not told that he went so far as some other kings later, and I don't think he did, like Manasseh. But he's on that path. And so he has wisdom, but he didn't always use it. We could say that Solomon was the epitome of the hypocrite then. He's so wise, and he can give such good advice, but then if you looked at how he lived his life, you might struggle. Or is it that Solomon is the epitome of humanity? And that a lot of us are like that. We can give some good advice to people, but then if they start looking at our lives pretty closely and putting them under the microscope, we might not fare so well. So the lesson here is to be careful. That one can have all the knowledge and resources. One, let's say, can study the Bible and know it like the back of your hand. One can know what one should do as far as discerning between right and wrong. We can have all this wisdom. We can be like Solomon, the man who had everything, had miraculous wisdom, surpassed everybody, and yet not live or follow after God in the end. The man who had everything teaches us having wisdom is one thing, putting it into practice is a bit more than that. Then we also learn from Solomon that success is deceptive. And that's going to be your word there. I said earlier it's not all that it's cracked up to be, as a more pithy way of putting it, but success is deceptive. How many times have we seen it? The celebrity, the millionaire, billionaire, and it looks like they have, to borrow the phrase again, they have everything. The success, the wealth, popularity, everybody knows their name, they're in the news, and not in bad ways. They've got it all. And then they are in the news because of suicide. Or then they file bankruptcy and die without anything. And social media has elevated this because we see it more, and we see people, it looks like their lives are just perfect. They've got the perfect marriage, and everybody looks great in the pictures, and the kids are just perfect too, and they've got the cars and the house or houses. And somehow they probably never work much. It's almost like the HGTV thing, where they're coming out with a huge budget for the house, and then, he takes care of, he works at a pet shelter, and she teaches yoga, and their budget is $2 million. Where does the money come from, right? We see things like that where people, they just have this, and then you see behind the scenes. And reality is a different picture than the post on social media or what appears to be, at least at first. I think you could look at Solomon a lot like that. The man who had everything. I listed some passages there of peace and prosperity from 1 Kings 4, 1 Kings 5, 1 Kings 10. He was born to David and Bathsheba during a time of war. He lived and reigned during a time of peace. He brought peace. He brought prosperity to his lands, at least for a while. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 10 now, beginning at verse 23. 1 Kings 10, verses 23 through the end of the chapter. We see how his wisdom led to financial success. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 23. It says, "Thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, and mules, so much, year by year." And so his wisdom, like we said, everybody's showing up at his door, they bring in their gifts. And then the economy and the military continues to grow. Look at the next paragraph, 1 Kings 10:26. "Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen." We may not think these numbers are that big today. We think about military prowess and size, but this is a big deal in their time. Have that many as a standing army. And then he stationed them in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. And the king made silver, look at this, as common in Jerusalem as stone. And he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Shelah. And Solomon's import of horses from Egypt, you might want to remember that one, and Cu, and the king's traders received them from Cu at a price. And chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. So through the king's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. Solomon as king brings success. This is, even as it's right before the house of cards comes tumbling down. And the last part of Solomon's reign, that's written in the second half of the next chapter, 1 Kings 11, there is conflict. There is resistance. There are problems for the peace and prosperity of good King Solomon. And then we have those warnings. Now the handout says Deuteronomy 17 through 17. You see that? Okay. That, I don't know who wrote that. I'm gonna protest and say it wasn't me. It's supposed to be Deuteronomy 17, 16, and 17, and then verse 20. So if you want to amend that, you're welcome to, because I'm going to do that to my copies too. Right? Let's read that passage, Deuteronomy chapter 17. This is all the way back here before Moses dies. He gives instructions and restrictions to the future kings of Israel. Deuteronomy 17, we're going to pick up here at verse 16. He's describing how they're not to put a foreigner over them in the previous verse. And then he says this, only he must not acquire, what does it say? Many horses for himself, or cause the people to do what? To return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. If you didn't know better, you'd think somebody read Deuteronomy 17 and they just said, okay, this is what we're going to have this new character do. Because it's like Solomon is following a script. But he's not. It's real. And then it goes on to say, he shall not acquire many wives for himself. I don't know how many he is. How many did Solomon have? Somebody said 700, somebody said 1,000. If you put the wives and concubines together, and as far as I'm concerned, you could put them together, yeah, and you're right at 1,000. I don't know. Maybe if you walked up to Solomon, maybe he'd say, no, I need a few more. But I think that qualifies as many, don't you? This is what Deuteronomy 17 says. To acquire many wives for himself, and then lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And then, verse 20 is when he's supposed to be writing out the word, his own copy of the law, and read it all the days of his life, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. Success is deceptive. If you just read 1 Kings, he sounds like he's got everything and all is well in the kingdom. Now let's turn back to 1 Kings. Last two. Number 5, if we're counting them, Solomon teaches us that relationships can be dangerous. Dangerous. 1 Kings chapter 11. Well, actually, we'll go to 1 Kings chapter 3 for the start. Go back to 1 Kings 3. 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1. It says that Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh. So maybe this is some of the going back to Egypt too, isn't it? He marries Pharaoh's daughter. Alliance. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. This is where it began with Solomon. And it's interesting. This is said right before he makes his good request and gets the wisdom. And so you think, okay, this is pre-wise Solomon. This is when he's still foolish and he doesn't have the wisdom. So yeah, he makes a bad choice in his wife and his alliances. But then the end is 1 Kings 11, 1 through 3. 1 Kings 11, 1 through 3 says, now Solomon loved many. So even if we didn't think 1,000 is many, the text says many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, and then it gives the list: Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women. These are all the nations that were usually the enemies of Israel, the people that God had said, if you aren't careful, this is back in Deuteronomy 7 even, you marry with them, you let your sons marry with them, you get too close to them, they're going to influence you. Relationships, whether it's marriage or otherwise even, people that we allow to influence and pull on our heartstrings can be dangerous. Here's what happens. It says, these are the ones which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall you with them, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. And then there it is. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And I overlapped with our last thought. So it started with marrying Pharaoh's daughter. And then it ended up with all of this. And although idolatry is where this leads, pure idolatry, I wonder if the idolatry was also the people in his life that he allowed to lead him, his heart, astray. There's a caution here, a warning here. And it isn't just as simple as don't marry 700 people. That'd be pretty easy, and we walk away tonight and think, okay, I haven't married 700 people, I'm good to go. It's a bit more complex than that, isn't it? The example is 700,000, but the lesson is be careful of people who influence your life. Be careful what you allow to be elevated and how it influences you. Be careful. You don't allow, whether it's your spouse or your job or your hobby or whatever it is, to get too strong of a clutch on your heart, so that, as it says here, you cling to it a bit too much. The relationships can be dangerous. And then this last one. We realize from Solomon's life that wholeheartedness is so valuable. When you go back to 1 Kings chapter 3, you read of how Solomon was following after God, it says, in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. But then the writer says only, or except, he was offering sacrifices. The sacrifices were still at this point to God, but he was offering them on the high places. That's why he's there in Gibeon. Now this one gets a little tricky, because if you read the parallel in 2 Chronicles 1, it says the reason Solomon and the people were there because the tabernacle was there. That's where they were supposed to go and offer sacrifices and worship God. And so it's difficult to determine exactly how bad this was. Now later, it's always bad. Anytime a king or anyone is offering any kind of sacrifice on a high place, high places were these elevated altars that were always, later at least, associated with evil and idolatry. They were always a no-no, to put it that way. How does this work with Solomon? Is it that it's full sin here? Or is it more that this is it's a problem, it's a danger? At least because of the location, even though the tabernacle's there and he's offering sacrifices to God. But then after he makes his request from God in verse 15 of 1 Kings 3, then he goes back to Jerusalem and offers sacrifices to God. They bring the tabernacle back to Jerusalem, and then he offers in the right place in Jerusalem. So there's something there that takes a little thinking through, and maybe there's not an exact answer on that. But it does indicate that there were some early things here happening with Solomon in worship. And then he gets a warning. In 1 Kings chapter 9, 1 through 9, God comes to him a second time and warns him specifically about his heart not being drawn away. And then the problem itself. Let's go back to 1 Kings chapter 11. I'm still open there myself. Let's pick up where we left off. His wives pulled his heart away, the text has said. And then we read this. We'll go back to verse 4. That when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of his father David was. Notice that it doesn't say that he turned completely away from God. That would also be easier. It'd be easier for us to self-examine and say, well, I'm still following God. I'm still going to church. I'm still reading my Bible. I still believe in God. I'm still worshiping God. That's not the problem. It would be the problem with some later kings where they really left the true God altogether and just worshiped false gods only. It's not the problem. The problem is, we might use the phrase or the term compartmentalized, that he still had part of his heart given to the true God, but then His heart was pulled in different directions. It wasn't whole. He allowed himself to be led by the influence into idolatry. Look at the rest of the text. It says his heart was not wholly true. For Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord. And then it says again, as David his father had done. By the way, a fun experiment you can do with this chapter is to read all of 1 Kings 11 and just mark down, count how many times the writer goes back to David. He's constantly holding up. Here's David, the guy who committed adultery as king and murder. He was somehow held up as the good guy here, his father, and Solomon not so much, because his heart wasn't totally loyal near the end of his life. And so it says he even built high places, 7 and 8 says, and he did so, the end of verse 8 says, for his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrifices to their gods. Solomon's greatest problem, the problem, was a heart problem. It's been said that our heart is an idolatry, an idol factory. That if left unchecked, if we're not working to keep this in check, if we're not looking at the parts of our lives and seeing what we prioritize and what we allow to influence us more than other things, what is my real God, then we will be drawn naturally. We will default to worship and following after something. And it won't be today a high place and an animal on an altar. It'll look different. It'll be more deceitful in that way. It won't be as obvious. Then in verses 9 through 14, really the rest of the chapter, but I put down 9 through 14 as a good capsule of 1 Kings chapter 11. You get the consequences. And this one, I don't know how I would feel about this if I was Solomon. Because God says, I'm going to take the kingdom away from you. But I'm not going to do it in your reign because of your dad. Back to David. And so it's like, okay, God's going to have mercy on me, but it's not really mercy on me. It's just because of who my dad was. And then I'm going to leave you with one, really two, but one major tribe because of your dad, because of David. But really the kingdom is going to be taken from you, divided at least, because of this heart issue. The man who had everything lost everything because he lost his heart for God. From Solomon's lie, we learn that God can take the ugly, turn it into beauty. We learn something about the ability to ask humbly and correctly in life. We also see that it's one thing to have wisdom, it's another thing to use it in life. We see that success is deceptive and that relationships can be dangerous. And we see the value of wholeheartedness. Or to flip that, we see the problem of idolatry in our hearts. So how do we remember Solomon? As the good wise king who wrote portions of Scripture like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, the one who built the temple? Or do we remember him as the one who had many foreign wives, accumulated things God said kings weren't supposed to, fell into idolatry, and lost the kingdom in a generation? Both? I don't know. And we do not know what happened. We'd like to think that Solomon, before he died, turned back. Some think maybe that's somehow Ecclesiastes, the story of Ecclesiastes fits into that. But we do not know. Scripture tells us he dies in the end of 1 Kings 11, but doesn't say anything to indicate that he changed. It just says, in his old age, he turned his heart, or his heart was turned. But here's maybe the thing to close with this evening. Chance is going to lead us in an invitation song. Solomon's life doesn't easily translate to becoming a Christian per se. But the invitation is yours. And then let's consider this. That Solomon as a king points us, like so many signposts throughout the Bible, points us to the king who is wise and good like Solomon, but has none of Solomon's faults. To the king of Israel and more, who said on one occasion that someone greater than Solomon is here. Solomon, in all of his glory and wisdom, riches and sin, points us to King Jesus, who calls us to follow him with all our hearts. As we stand together and sing.